Listening Library presents Who is Steven Spielberg? By Stephanie Spinner. Illustrated by Daniel Mather. Who is Steven Spielberg? When Steven Spielberg was 10, he borrowed his father's movie camera. He used it to film all kinds of things: model train wrecks, camping trips, and even the hubcaps on the family car. In fact, he borrowed the camera so often that his father finally gave it to him. From that day on, the Spielberg living room became a movie set, cluttered with props. While other kids played sports, Steven dreamed up stories to film. Instead of doing homework, he wrote scripts. He figured out how to use lighting, sound, and camera angles to get the effects he wanted. He developed the knack of persuading his parents, his sisters, and anybody else who was around to put on costumes and act for him. Luckily for Steven, his parents encouraged him, and so did his friends. The very first time he showed one of his short movies to the members of his Boy Scout troop, they shouted and cheered. Their applause only confirmed what Steven already knew, that his favorite place in the world was behind a camera. Today, just about everybody knows who Steven Spielberg is. He directed 4 of the most successful films of all time: Jaws, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and Jurassic Park. He's won 2 Oscars for Best Director and an Oscar for Best Picture. He's produced dozens of films and television shows, created video games, and headed up his own movie studio. His work has dazzled fans all over the world. But his favorite place is still behind a movie camera. Chances are it always will be. Chapter 1. Brownie Hog. Steven Allen Spielberg was born on December 18, 1946 in Cincinnati, Ohio. World War II was finally over, and the country was getting back to normal. In the mid-40s, that meant fathers commuted to their jobs, most mothers stayed home with their kids, cars were American, and telephones were connected to wires. It was a time when middle class families flocked to the suburbs. Life there was safe, peaceful, and just a little bit dull. Steven grew up in suburbia, but his household was far from dull. His parents, Leah Posner and Arnold Spielberg, were Jewish, the children of immigrants. Though they were both from Cincinnati, they didn't meet until 1942, after Arnold had enlisted in the Army. Shortly after their first and only date, he was shipped off to fight in Burma, a small Asian country on the other side of the world. But he and Leah wrote to each other until he came home in 1944, and they were married the next year. Arnold loved science and machines. After finishing his studies in electrical engineering, he quickly found work in the brand new field of computer science. At that time, computers were the size of entire rooms, and few people knew about them. Arnold was one of the first. Leah came from a devout family that was also very creative. She had relatives in vaudeville and the theater. One of her uncles was a lion tamer, a fairly unusual profession for someone in an Orthodox Jewish family. It was difficult to find a place where the family could put down roots. Because Arnold was such an outstanding engineer, he was always being offered new and better jobs, which meant that the Spielbergs moved a lot. They went from Ohio, where Stephen was born, to Camden, New Jersey. After his sister Anne was born, the family moved to Haddon Township, New Jersey, where his sisters Sue and Nancy were born. When Nancy was still a baby, they moved to Phoenix, Arizona. Going from one school to another was hard for Stephen. As soon as he got to know kids his own age, the family was on the move again. He was always the new boy in class and spent a lot of his childhood feeling like an outsider. In Phoenix, his refuge was his cluttered bedroom. He kept turtles, free-flying parakeets, and a lizard in there, and he wrote stories instead of doing his homework. Stephen often longed for a friend who was as different as he was. Sometimes he thought that a small, kindly alien would be ideal. Years later, Stephen made E.T. the Extraterrestrial one of the most popular movies of all time. But in 1957, kids like Stephen didn't make movies. They watched them. That changed on Father's Day, when Leah gave Arnold a movie camera. It was an 8mm Brownie, inexpensive and easy to operate, the kind people use for home movies. Stephen couldn't wait to borrow it. At first, he staged and filmed crashes with his Lionel trains and watched the films over and over. He thought they were great. His dad's movies, on the other hand, were blurry and boring. Stephen had lots of suggestions for improving them. But his father had a better idea. He simply gave Stephen the camera. Stephen took on the job of filming the family's camping trips. He got his parents and sisters to wear costumes, gave them parts to play, and told them how and where to move. As young as he was, he quickly mastered the Brownie and began taking it with him everywhere. In the Boy Scouts, he made a 9-minute Western to earn a merit badge in photography. He cast his fellow scouts as cowboys, and when he screened it for them, the troop went wild, shouting, whistling, and cheering. In that moment, Stephen said later, I knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. He was 11 years old. Chapter 2. Nerdy but cool. Stephen was used to being called a nerd. He didn't play baseball or football, and he could barely run a mile. He was practically invisible to girls. He was short and skinny. He stammered. He bit his nails, and he was Jewish. In Phoenix, a city with very few Jewish families, that made him a little different. But with a camera, he was less lonely and less of an outsider. He made one short film after another. First came Fighter Squad, about World War II pilots in action. After filming the cockpit of a plane at a local airport, he combined his footage with old newsreels showing actual U.S. fighter planes in the air. It looked pretty convincing, especially to his friends. In 1962, he completed Escape to Nowhere, about U.S. soldiers trying to escape enemy troops in the African desert. The Arizona desert near Stephen's neighborhood made a great substitute for the real thing. Most ambitious of all was Firelight, a 2-hour science fiction movie about alien kidnappings. It took Stephen a year to finish and cost $800. That was a truly big budget for a kid back then. But Stephen took it in stride. Now 16, he was learning how to make action pictures with no driver's license, very little money, and parents who wouldn't let him go out unless he did his homework. Luckily, his parents were almost always encouraging. Arnold got Steven permission to film the airport and the plane for Fire Squad. Leah made the soldiers' costumes for Escape to Nowhere and drove the family's old army jeep into the desert so Steven could film it. Arnold donated $500 to Firelight's budget, and when it was finished, he rented a theater in Phoenix for the opening. Standing on a tall, shaky ladder, Leah put the film's title up the marquee. She had already invited the whole neighborhood to make sure that the theater was full. On the evening of March 24th, 1964, the family rode to the theater in a limousine. Steven had paid for it so they could arrive in style. It was a happy occasion for all of them. While Steven was making his early movies, his social life improved a lot. He found out that giving his classmates acting parts was like inviting them to a really great party, and they all wanted to come. Steven was 16 when Escape to Nowhere won first prize in an amateur film contest, the Canyon Films Junior Film Festival. Exciting as that was, it couldn't make up for the fact that the Spielbergs were moving again. This time, it was to Saratoga, California, where his dad would be working for IBM, the computer company. For Steven, far worse than the move was the news that his parents were separating. The family broke apart slowly and painfully in California. After filing for divorce, Leah moved back to Arizona with Anne, Sue, and Nancy. Steven stayed with Arnold in California. It was the unhappiest time in his life. Yet the move brought him much closer to the center of the film industry, which was exactly where he belonged. Chapter 3. Studio Stowaway. Saratoga, California, less than 50 miles from San Francisco, is now part of Silicon Valley. But in 1964, it was just another small middle-class suburb. Saratoga High, Steven's new school, wasn't all that different from Arcadia High in Phoenix. Unlike many teenagers in the mid-1960s, he wasn't interested in drugs, rock and roll, or politics. All he cared about was breaking into the movie business any way he could. His chance came the summer before his senior year of high school. While visiting cousins in Los Angeles, Steven took a tour of Universal Studios. He was soon fidgeting with boredom. He had zero interest in seeing things like the street set of Leave It to Beaver, a 1950s television show. He wanted to go behind the scenes to view the studio's inner workings. So he left the tour during the bathroom break and wandered around the vast lot by himself, trying to look as if he belonged. That worked until a man named Chuck Silvers spotted him. Silvers, Universal's film librarian, guessed correctly that this skinny, long-haired kid in jeans was not a studio employee. But after a few minutes of conversation, he was so impressed with Steven that he gave him a 3-day pass to the lot. It was Steven's ticket to heaven. The next day, wearing his ill-fitting bar mitzvah suit and a tie, and carrying a briefcase with a candy bar in it, he strolled past the guard at the gate. He did it again for the next 2 days, and each time the guard, called Scotty, waved him in. Steven never had to show his pass. Delighted with the back security system, Steven kept coming to the studio every day for weeks, always in his rumpled suit. He roamed around the sound stages taking notes. One day he found an empty office on the lot, so he called the switchboard and had the office's phone hooked up. Then, with the office as a base, he spent his days hanging around sets, talking with directors, editors, and actors, and learning everything he could about the business. It was the education of his dreams. Even getting kicked off of Alfred Hitchcock sets was a thrill. Returning to high school for his senior year was quite a letdown. So was getting rejected by the film schools at the University of Southern California and the University of California, Los Angeles because of his poor grades. The only school that would take him was California State College at Long Beach, and it didn't even have a film department. Steven didn't want to go, but his parents felt differently. And though he wasn't getting along with either of them, they did help him face reality. It was 1965. The country was at war again. And if he didn't go to college, he would be drafted into the army and sent to fight in Vietnam. Even a college without a film department was better than taking part in a war he didn't believe in. So Steven enrolled at Long Beach as an English major, went to as few classes as possible, and spent most of his time at Universal Studios. To actually get a paying job at a studio like Universal, Steven had to persuade people to take a look at his films. And that was a lot harder than getting past Scotty at the security gate. All Steven's movies were on 8mm film because it was the cheapest to buy and process. Professionals worked in 35mm, which provided better images but was much more expensive. Anything else was considered kid stuff, not worth watching. The situation was frustrating, but now Steven's luck, which had been good so far, got even better. A young producer agreed to pay for Steven to make his first 35mm film called Amblin. It was about two young hitchhikers, a boy and a girl, who meet and spend a day together and then part. Steven made it without dialogue because it was cheaper that way. Even so, Amblin was clever, funny, and original. When film librarian Chuck Silver saw Amblin, he loved it. He called Sidney Sheinberg, an executive at Universal TV, and told him to drop everything there was a film by a kid named Spielberg that he just had to see. After watching Amblin, Sheinberg arranged to meet Steven the following day. Sheinberg was surprised to see someone who looked like a teenager, but he could tell right away that Steven knew more about filmmaking than most pros twice his age. He also knew that Universal's business television department needed directors, so he offered Steven a 7-year contract. Steven confessed later, "I quit college so fast I didn't even clean out my locker." Chapter 4. TV Training Wheels. If Steven was nervous about directing an early episode of Night Gallery, a series of spooky half-hour shows with twisty surprise endings, he didn't show it. Even working with Joan Crawford, a movie star old enough to be his grandmother, didn't seem to rattle him. He was all business on the set. He knew he had to be. A lot depended on this first job. Movie talk. People in the film industry use lots of interesting words and expressions. Blockbuster, a very, very successful movie. Box office, the total amount of money a film earns through ticket sales. CGI, computer-generated images, film images and special effects created on a computer. Feature film, a movie that is at least 40 minutes long. Most feature films are at least an hour long. Franchise, a movie can become a franchise if it branches out into sequels, video games, television shows, action figures, or books. Green light. Getting a green light means enough money has been raised for work on a movie to start. Post-production. The period after filming or principal photography is complete, editing, adding the soundtrack, and putting in special effects are all done in post-production. Short film. A film that is less than 40 minutes long. Storyboard. A series of drawings or sketches like a comic strip showing the action and camera angles in a movie. This way of planning scenes began in the 1930s with Walt Disney and his animators. Some directors like Steven still use storyboards. Steven charmed Joan Crawford, who could behave like Cruella de Vil if she chose, and she delivered a great performance for him. The finished show was as scary as it was supposed to be, and it aired on schedule. Executives at Universal were happy. In no time at all, Steven had a real office at the studio, a new convertible, and a house of his own in Laurel Canyon. The one thing he didn't have was a green light or go-ahead to make a full-length feature film. Steven directed many TV episodes and a handful of hour-long made-for-TV movies. One of them, called The Jewel, was an eerie, nearly wordless thriller that drew glowing reviews and was later released in European movie theaters. Critics praised Jewel so highly that Steven got at least a dozen offers to direct feature films after its debut. But none of them intrigued him as much as a news story he had read about a young Texas couple called the Dents. They were so desperate to get their son back from a foster home that they became outlaws, and dozens of police cars chased them from one end of Texas to the other. Steven knew the story would make a great movie. He also knew that it would require a budget of $2.5 million. He managed to get Universal to pay for him to write a script about the Dents, but that was all. Meanwhile, Richard Zennick and David Brown, two talented producers, joined Universal and read the script. They decided they wanted to make the film with Steven directing and convinced the head of the studio to give Steven's movie idea a green light. He began shooting the Sugarland Express in January 1973. a few weeks after his 26th birthday. Zanuck and Brown were amazed by how well the kid handled the shoot. He directed the actors, the 50 cars and drivers, and the many dangerous stunts like an old pro. Though film critics loved the Sugarland Express, audiences didn't, and that was very disappointing to Steven. He knew that if his next movie wasn't a success, his career might be over. Chapter 5. Shark Attack. On a visit to the Brown/Zanuck offices one day in 1973, Steven noticed a copy of an unpublished novel on Zanuck's desk and read it over the weekend. Called Jaws. It was about a killer shark that terrorizes a small resort town. It hooked Steven right away, and the producers agreed to let him direct a film version. He was thrilled, but not for long. The shoot was plagued with problems from day one. First, there was the location. Martha's Vineyard, a small island in Massachusetts, is a popular summer resort. In good weather, its waters are crowded with yachts, sailboats, water skiers, and swimmers. Steven couldn't show his shark hunters battling a great white with tourists on a fishing boat waving in the background. So almost every day, he and the crew had to wait for the ocean to clear. That took hours and hours of precious daylight, and the schedule slowed down to a crawl. Then there was the weather. When it was stormy, sailors and tourists kept out of the water. But bad weather made shooting on the ocean difficult, dangerous, and sometimes impossible. That meant more delays. And then there was the shark. The great white had to be so huge and scary that audiences would scream when it appeared. No real great white could be trained for a film, and it was decades before modern CGI, so a mechanical shark was made. Weighing 12 tons, it had cold, staring eyes, teeth as big as carving knives, and a body the size of a stretch limo. Steven named it Bruce, after his lawyer. During the very first camera test, Bruce broke apart and sank straight to the ocean floor. He had to be towed away for 3 weeks' worth of repairs, a disaster for the film schedule and budget. Because so much was going wrong, the crew started calling the movie flaws. The actors wanted to quit. And there were rumblings at Universal about shutting down the movie. Sidney Sheinberg, who by then was president of Universal, promised Steven his full support. Steven vowed to finish the film, and he did. But even after it was edited and set to music, he worried that Jaws would flop. "I was out of my mind with fear," he said later. At an early screening during the first gruesome shark attack, the man sitting next to him rushed out of the theater, gagging. "He'll never come back," Steven thought miserably. But a few minutes later, the man did come back. He raced to his seat as if he couldn't stand to miss another second of the movie, even after throwing up. At that moment, Steven knew Jaws would be a hit. When it was released in the summer of 1975, critics were divided about Jaws, but not about Bruce. He was one terrifying shark, and suddenly everybody wanted to see him. So Universal tried something new. Instead of sending copies of the movie to a few theaters, which is also what a studio usually did when the movie opened, Universal sent it to hundreds of theaters across the country, so everybody could see Bruce. The experiment worked. Jaws was a spectacular hit, the first ever summer blockbuster, earning a whopping $260 million. It also became the top-grossing film in history. Already planning another film, Steven knew one thing for sure. My next picture will be made on dry land, he said. There won't even be a bathroom scene. Chapter 6. Calling All Aliens. True to his word, Steven set his next picture far from the ocean, though it did have 2 bathroom scenes. Much of Close Encounters of a Third Kind takes place in Wyoming, atop a mountain called Devil's Tower. In science fiction terms, an encounter of the first kind is a sighting of an unidentified flying object, UFO. An encounter of the second kind is seeing or feeling the effects of the UFO. An encounter of a third kind is having direct contact with the UFO and its alien passengers. The script, which Steven wrote, tells 2 stories. One is about Roy Neary, a man so obsessed with UFOs that he leaves his family to find them. The other is about Claude Lacombe, the leader of the top-secret U.S. project designed to make contact with aliens. The stories overlap when Roy and Claude meet at Devil's Tower. Just a spectacular, close encounter of a third kind with an enormous spaceship begins. Steven based his screenplay on his own science fiction movie Firelight, and on dozens of articles and books about UFOs. He read accounts of alien abductions or kidnappings, and spoke with many scientists who thought there could be life in other parts of the universe. When Steven wrote Close Encounters of a Third Kind, he decided that there would be no bad guys in it. He made the alien visitors peaceful and very intelligent. Their spaceship is as big as a city. Its landing is dazzling, a special effects extravaganza of light and sound. When the aliens invite Roy to leave Earth with them, he accepts happily. Science fiction in the movies, science fiction ATT. Amistad describe how people might be affected by imaginary scientific developments. Science fiction movies are often about time travel, life on other worlds, and artificial intelligence, computers. Many are set in the future. Some, like Close Encounters of a Third Kind and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, take place in the present, but include aliens, creatures from other planets. Some of the best-known science fiction movies of all time include 2001, A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, Star Wars, Alien, Back to the Future, Men in Black, The Matrix, Avatar, and of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and Jurassic Park. Close Encounters of a Third Kind seems to be saying that life beyond our galaxy might be friendly. This hopeful message may be one reason why so many people, not all of them science fiction fans, love the movie. It made hundreds of millions of dollars and brought Steven his first Oscar nomination for Best Director. Chapter 7. Indiana Jones and the Adventure That Just Wouldn't Stop. One day in 1977, two bearded men sat on a beach deep in conversation. Anyone passing by would have thought they were ordinary tourists, enjoying yet another perfect day in Hawaii. The truth was much more interesting. The men were Steven Spielberg and the film director George Lucas, and they were talking about making a movie together. Friends since the late 60s, they had more in common than their age, their talent, and their beards. They both loved the Saturday afternoon serials of their childhood. These short movies were shown in weekly segments like chapters in a book, before the main features. They were adventure stories with wild chases and cliffhanger endings. Their heroes were daredevils, strong, brave, and reckless. George told Steven that he'd been thinking about writing a serial-style movie script for a long time. The hero was a treasure-seeking archaeologist who cracked a mean bullwhip and wore a fedora hat. His name would be Indiana Smith, and the movie would be called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Steven liked everything but the hero's name. "Well, how about Indiana Jones?" asked George. With that, Steven agreed to direct, and the project began to take shape very, very slowly. 3 years later, after Lucas's Star Wars had passed Jaws as the top-grossing film in history, George and Steven had a screenplay. They even had their Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford, who played Han Solo in Star Wars. While the new Indy began bullwhip lessons and a costume director tracked down the perfect 1930s style fedora, Steven planned some of the movie's many action scenes on storyboards. Working on location in the North African country of Tunisia, he filmed quickly with as few takes as possible. He had promised George, who was producing the film, that Raiders of the Lost Ark would stay on schedule. Despite blistering heat, a scene with 7,000 live snakes, including 5 deadly cobras, and another scene with hundreds of tarantulas. Steven finished almost 2 weeks early. The shoot had been fun but exhausting. When Raiders opened a few months later, it was a smash, the most successful film of 1981. Because of Indiana Jones, fedoras became popular again. There was a sudden demand for beat-up, indie-style leather jackets, and Steven Spielberg became a household name. Chapter 8. A Friend from Far Away. Now that Steven was a celebrity, the public wanted to know everything about him, including what his childhood was like. When was he going to make a movie about that? In many ways, E.T. the Extraterrestrial reflects feelings Steven had as a boy. Set in suburban California, it centers around the friendship between Elliot, a timid 5th grader, and E.T., a toddler-sized alien stranded on Earth. When E.T. is captured by government agents, Elliot finds the courage to plan a daring rescue. He gets E.T. back to his spaceship so that the little alien can return home. Of course, Steven did not befriend an alien when he was a boy. But as an outsider in one suburban town after another, he often imagined a friend like E.T., and the fantasy stayed with him. One night, while he was on location for Rare's Lost Ark, Steven began writing a story about the little alien. What if I were 10 years old again, he wondered, and he needed me as much as I needed him. Steven made E.T. almost entirely from Elliot's point of view. He shot the film so that audiences see what Elliot sees and understand how he feels. In Elliot's world, kids always keep secrets from grown-ups, hardly ever tell them the truth, and never doubt for a second that E.T. is worth fighting for, especially when E.T. makes their bikes fly. For audiences, Steven's skill with the young cast was just one of the film's many attractions. E.T. won praise for its script, its special effects, its photography, its music, and its editing. Steven was nominated for another Oscar again for Best Director. As for E.T., the wrinkly, wobbly alien became America's weirdest little sweetheart. His plaintive cry, E.T. phone home, became the catchphrase of the year. E.T. was Steven's biggest hit yet. It made more money than any other movie in history, topping Jaws and even Star Wars. In 1984, Steven made his first sequel, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, was another action-packed, sometimes gruesome movie adventure, this time set in India. The heroine, a blonde nightclub singer, was played by actress Kate Capshaw. In the movie, a hungry elephant eats her best costume. Boa constrictors hug her. She's served eyeball soup and his monkey brains for dinner, and she breaks at least 2 fingernails, all before Indy even kisses her. The tremendous success of E.T. and Temple of Doom gave Steven a lot more creative freedom. He would still direct the kind of action adventures and summer blockbusters that audiences wanted from him. They were his popcorn movies. They had made him famous, but now he could make more serious films too. Chapter 9. Turning Points. Steven called his next film, my first serious movie, The Color Purple, based on the book by Alice Walker. It is about 2 African-American sisters in rural Georgia who were cruelly separated in their early teens. It's set mainly in the 1930s, and almost all the characters are African American. Many of them are women whose struggles are harsh and disturbing, and there isn't a single explosion or alien in the entire story. Making The Color Purple marked a turning point in Steven's career. There was another important turning point in Steven's life that year. He and his longtime girlfriend, actress Amy Irving, had a son together. They named him Max, and married soon after the baby was born. Though being a new father took a lot of Steven's time, he still worked twice as hard as most other people in Hollywood. He wrote successful screenplays for other directors, produced films, and embarked on his first big historical epic. Empire of the Sun is about the Japanese invasion of China during World War II. The movie has thousands and thousands of extras and dozens of speaking parts. There are huge, powerful crowd scenes, but the story hits home because Steven tells it from a young boy's point of view. Jamie, the son of wealthy English parents, must fend for himself after the invasion. Jamie is played by Christian Bale, and like some other child actors who worked with Steven, he went on to become very famous. Steven loved being a father and yearned for a close, loving family, something he hadn't always had when he was growing up. But in 1989, his marriage to Amy Irving ended. They agreed to raise Max jointly. Steven said very little about his divorce. Instead, he worked harder than ever. He made a romantic ghost story called Always, and a third Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He produced an Indiana Jones television special and the film Back to the Future Part 2. Meanwhile, Kate Capshaw, the actress from Temple of Doom, re-entered his life. Steven had once said that the best thing about making that movie was that I met Kate Capshaw. They fell in love, and after she converted to Judaism, they married. As newlyweds, Steven and Kate already had a fair-sized family. There was Max, Steven's son, and Jessica, Kate's daughter, with her first husband. There was Theo, Kate's adopted African-American son. And there was Sasha, the daughter Steven and Kate had together in 1990. With a fresh crop of grandchildren to love, Steven's mother Leah drew closer to her son again. The only person missing from this new family picture was Steven's father, Arnold. He and Steven hadn't spoken to each other in many years, because Steven had never forgiven Arnold for his parents' divorce. Kate felt this had to change. She persuaded Steven to contact his father, and once he did, the long silence between them ended. Now that he was a father himself, Steven could understand Arnold better, and the two once again became very close. Chapter 10: Raptors and Oscars. Steven had always wanted to make a dinosaur movie. When he read Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, he knew it was the story he'd been looking for. Scientists find insects that had fed on dinosaur blood trapped in amber, preserving the dinosaur's DNA. John Hammond, who is rich enough to own a large tropical island, gets hold of the DNA and uses it to clone dinosaurs. Before long, herds of them are roaming a huge enclosure of Hammond's island. Jurassic Park, as Hammond calls it, will soon be the greatest tourist attraction of all time. Before it opens, 3 scientists of Hammond's grandchildren come for a preview. Then the dinosaurs get loose. The scariest is the angry Tyrannosaurus Rex, who makes the shark in Jaws look like a bath toy. Making Jurassic Park almost 20 years after Jaws, Steven could use the newest, most advanced CGI effects. They were amazing. This was the first movie ever made, he said, where the entire success or failure of a story was dependent on these digital characters. The film was a landmark in visual effects and earned an unprecedented $914 million worldwide. Steven did post-production work on Jurassic Park at night in Poland, and filmed Schindler's List during the day. Based on a true story, it's about a German businessman, Oskar Schindler, who comes to Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II, hoping to profit from the war. While Nazis are taking away Jews' property and making it illegal for them to earn money, Schindler sets up a factory in the city of Krakow. He hires only Jewish workers and quickly makes a fortune. The Nazi Party. The Nazi Party was a German political group that began in 1919. The Nazis believed that Aryans, white, Protestant Germans, were better than people of any other race. Adolf Hitler became the dictator, or Führer, of Nazi Germany in 1934. His government started off to kill off all impure people under German rule, including Jews, Romanies, homosexuals, Catholics, and mentally challenged. The Nazis' carefully planned program of mass murder took a total of 11 million lives. 6 million victims were Jews. These murders are known as the Holocaust. Nazi rule ended in 1945 with Germany's defeat in World War II. Schindler does not come to Poland to save Jews. He is not a very noble man at first, but when he sees what is happening around him, he changes. Using charm, cunning, and huge bribes, he persuades the Nazis to leave his workers alone. He risks his life more than once and loses most of his money. His bravery and generosity saved the lives of 1,100 people. Making Schindler's List was intensely painful for Steven. During the Holocaust, the Nazis had killed many relatives on his father's side of the family who had lived in Russia and Poland. Steven wanted the film to honor them and to honor the millions of other victims who died. He also wanted his children to understand this terrible time in Jewish history. It was the first time my children ever saw me cry, he said. When Schindler's List opened, audiences cried too. Though it was sad and sometimes shocking, it also showed courage and decency overcoming terrible evil. The film won the Oscar for Best Feature Film of 1993, and Steven won his first Oscar for Best Director. Who is Oscar? Oscar, the gold-plated statuette given out at the Academy Awards ceremony every year, is probably the most famous trophy in the world. It is also considered the highest possible honor in filmmaking. Each Oscar is awarded after a secret vote by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which has thousands of members, though its official name is the Academy Award of Merit. The award is almost always called the Oscar. Nobody knows exactly why. One popular story is that on first seeing the statuette, the Academy librarian said it looked just like her Uncle Oscar. The first Academy Awards were presented in 1929, at a small hotel diner. Since then, thousands of Academy Awards have been given out. An Oscar nomination has become a high honor in itself. A win practically guarantees fame and money, because the names of winners are kept secret. The suspense, both before and during the ceremony, runs high. Experienced performers often break into tears when their names are called. The Academy Awards ceremony is now televised in more than 200 countries, for hundreds of millions of movie fans all over the world. Sharing the excitement is a high point of each year. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Dream Company. After the 1994 Academy Awards, Steven took a break from movie making to spend time with his family. By now, he had 5 children: Max, Jessica, Theo, Sasha, and Sawyer, a son born in 1992. During this time, Steven's friends Jeffrey Katzenberg and David Geffen approached him about starting a film studio together. It was a daring idea. Nobody had launched a new studio for decades because it was so difficult and expensive. Yet Jeffrey Katzenberg had produced a string of animated mega hits for Disney, including The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King. David Geffen, whose work in the music business had made him a billionaire, one of the entertainment's most powerful deal makers. Steven was now considered the world's most successful director. If anybody could launch a new studio, it was these 3. Steven decided to join Jeffrey and David on 3 conditions. First, they wouldn't make more than 9 movies a year. Second, he would be free to direct for other studios. And third, he would leave work every day in time to have dinner with his family. They agreed. And in October 1994, DreamWorks Studios opened for business. Steven's first film for DreamWorks was Amistad, based on the true story of a slave ship mutiny in 1839. Captured by traders, chained and beaten, the Africans of the Amistad know that slavery awaits them when they reach Cuba. So they take over the ship and sail north. Then they are caught off the coast of Long Island and accused of murder. With the help of anti-slavery groups and former President John Quincy Adams, the Africans win their freedom. Though it takes many years, this is a powerful message about the need for tolerance and human kindness in Amistad, just as there is in Schindler's List and E.T. Steven said that he made Amistad for his adopted African-American son, Theo. His next DreamWorks film was for his father, whose stories about serving in World War II had fascinated him when he was a boy. An early scene in Saving Private Ryan begins on June 6, 1944, when American troops lead a massive surprise attack called D-Day against the Germans on France's northern coast. The long scene, which looks as real as a documentary, shows hundreds of soldiers dying under heavy German fire. Saving Private Ryan was a tribute to all the American soldiers who risked their lives in World War II. Steven knew that, like Schindler's List, the movie could be painful to watch, and he was prepared for audiences to stay away. But they didn't. Saving Private Ryan was the most successful American film of 1998. It was nominated for 11 Academy Awards and won Steven his second Oscar for Best Director. Chapter 12. Long-Term Projects. Steven turned 55 years old in 2001. He had won 3 Academy Awards. He ran a movie business with 2 good friends. He was closer to his parents than ever before, and his own family life was happy. He was a man who had everything, except a college degree. So that year, he re-enrolled at California State University Long Beach, took courses in their new film department, and graduated on May 31st, 2002, nearly 40 years after he had dropped out. The theme from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark played as he accepted his diploma. Steven kept making feature films. He directed 6 between 2001 and 2005. For anyone else, that would have been a lot. For Steven, who was also producing movies and television shows, creating video games, writing and supporting charities, and being a family man, it was life as usual. He liked to keep busy. Fans have been asking for another Indiana Jones adventure since the third one, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, in 1989. 19 years later, Steven finally made it for them. Indiana Jones in the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull takes place in the 1950s, when Indy is a lot older, but he's still tough enough to stop an evil Russian agent from brainwashing him. Fans love the older Indy, still played by Harrison Ford. They welcome his teenage rebel sidekick who turns out to be his son, and they were glad to see him marry Marion Ravenwood, the girlfriend who punched him in the jaw in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indy number 4 earned $800 million at the box office. Back in 1981, when Raiders first came out, Steven had read a review of the film that compared Indiana Jones to Tintin. Steven found out that Tintin was a Belgian comic strip character and that practically every kid in Europe was a huge fan. He decided Tintin's exciting adventures like Indy's would make a great movie. He bought the rights, but got stuck deciding if the movie should be animated or not. Years went by. In 2006, director Peter Jackson persuaded Steven to make the movie in 3D using performance capture. This technology can take an actor's live performance on film and turn it into a completely lifelike computer-generated character. Steven had admired Peter's use of performance capture in the Lord of the Rings movies. The 2 men were also friends, so it seemed natural for them to work together on the adventures of Tintin, with Steven directing and Peter producing. Although Steven finished filming the actors in 2009, the computer artists would need at least 2 years to complete the film. During that time, he made another movie. War Horse is about an English boy called Albert and his beloved horse Joey. When World War I begins, Joey is sold to an English captain and taken to fight in France. As the war drags on, Joey moves from one owner to the next. He experiences battles that are almost as frightening as the ones in Saving Private Ryan. Eventually, Albert finds him and saves his life. Just as the war ends, War Horse is an epic story. once again stressing the importance of loyalty, trust, and friendship. Steven had spent almost 30 years preparing for the adventures of Tintin and less than a year on Warhorse. Yet Warhorse earned 6 Academy Award nominations. Also released in 2011, Tintin earned over $300 million worldwide. Chapter 13, History Master. Steven had been thinking about making Lincoln for a very long time. He was finally able to start working on it in 2011, a year that marked the 150th anniversary of the start of the American Civil War. Lincoln takes place in 1865, during the last months of the president's life. The Civil War is coming to a close. After 4 bloody years, Lincoln knows the North will win, and he wants to end slavery once and for all. In the film, Lincoln faces 3 obstacles. He must unite the quarrelsome advisors in his cabinet so they stand behind him. He must win support for an amendment to the Constitution that will abolish slavery. And he must delay peace talks with the South until the amendment is passed. In Lincoln, we see the president not just as the great leader depicted in his history books, but as a shrewd politician who does whatever needs to be done to get the amendment passed. Scene by scene, the film shows us Lincoln's charm and powerful will. Long before the movie is over, we understand exactly why he deserves his place in history. A powerful reflection of Steven's lifelong interest in Abraham Lincoln, it opened to glowing reviews in late 2012. Steven Spielberg was never settled for being just a super successful Hollywood director. He has always made the movies he wanted to make. He has also encouraged and supported young filmmakers. He has founded charities and museums. He has been honored by the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, and the White House. He has made a Knight of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II, given a Knight Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit by the government of Germany, and made a Commander of the Order of the Crown in Belgium. His films have set and broken box office records for decades. They often show how acts of personal courage can change history. They have made people, millions and millions of people, laugh, cry, cheer, and hyperventilate. And it all started in 1957, when he borrowed his father's movie camera. The end.